Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're venturing back, way back to the foundational days of organized crime in the United States.
That's right. We've got some historical accounts, and we're going to sort of dissect the origins of one of America's earliest crime families.
Exactly. We'll be looking at, how this group got started, the key players, their
Yeah,
motivations.
and their initial impact, yeah. The goal is really to give you a clear but insightful look at how they emerged without getting bogged down in every single detail.
Right. We've got materials here detailing their formation, their early activities. So our mission for this deep dive,
Mm.
pull out the big insights, maybe some surprising facts too, about the Morello crime family.
Okay, let's get into it.
So our sources point to Giuseppe Morello as the starting point
Yeah.
in Italian Harlem, New York City.
Correct. The Morello family really gets going in the 1890s. It's a time of huge immigration, big changes in New York.
And they weren't just a flash in the pan, were they? Active until 1931?
Over 4 decades. That's
Oh.
that's significant staying power, especially for that era.
And their turf, it wasn't small.
No, not at all. Italian Harlem, sure, but also Little Italy,
No.
even pushing into parts of the Bronx.
That's a big slice of early New York.
It really is. And you have to remember their background, primarily Sicilian, that shaped everything, how they operated internally, how they dealt with other groups.
And their activities were pretty broad.
Oh, yeah. Early days of organized crime, so you see racketeering, definitely counterfeiting, we'll dig into that one,
Mm-hmm.
extortion, conspiracy, and, well, murder. Comes with the territory, unfortunately.
And they weren't alone out there. Sources mention rivals. Brooklyn Camorra, Tequila family, Shiro family.
Right, it was crowded, a very competitive underworld. These early years were all about fighting for turf, for power.
Constantly jostling for position.
Exactly. And it's important to see the bigger picture here. The Morellos weren't just another gang, they were like pioneers.
How so?
They were the predecessors of what eventually became the Genovese crime family, one
Yeah.
of big ones.
Okay, so there's a direct line.
A direct line. The Morellos established the territory, the rackets, the structure that the Genovese family built on. It wasn't just a name change, they laid the groundwork.
Got it. Okay, so that's the overview. Let's dig into the family itself. Where do they actually come from?
Back to Corleone, Sicily. A name that probably rings a bell for many people.
Yeah, just a bit.
Giuseppe Morello, the founder, born there May 2nd, 1867. He had a sister, Maria, born around 1869.
And their father.
Calogero Morello, he died quite young in 1872.
So their mother remarried.
She did. Angelina Piazza married Bernardo Terranova in 1873, and this marriage added 5 more kids to the mix.
Okay, so the family expands.
Right. Vincenzo, Ciro, Niccolo, Lucia, and Salvatrice. Plus, there's mention of maybe a third Terranova sister, Rosalia Lamonte. So it becomes this blended family unit.
When did they make the jump to the U.S.?
Giuseppe came first, 1892. Then the rest followed pretty quickly. March 1893, his wife, Maria Rosa, his mother, Angelina, stepfather, Bernardo, the half-brothers, Ciro, Niccolo, Vincenzo, and half-sister, Rosalia, they all arrive in New York.
But they didn't just plant roots in New York City immediately. I see some movement mentioned.
That's right, yeah. They landed in New York, but then spent some time down south, Louisiana, Texas.
Any idea why?
Probably looking for opportunities, Maybe connecting with other immigrants. Hard to say for sure, but they were back in New York City by 1896. Likely just adapting, finding their feet.
And once back in New York, the Terranova brothers start making a name for themselves. The 107th Street Mob.
Exactly. Or the Morello gang, sometimes called that too. They really started to dominate East Harlem, parts of the Bronx. That became their base.
Controlling local businesses, that sort of thing.
Likely started that way, yeah.
Yeah.
Protection rackets, controlling things through threats, basic stuff, but effective back then.
But it wasn't just the brothers on their own. Giuseppe Morello had a key ally, didn't he?
He did. Ignazio Lupo, down in Little Italy, Manhattan. Lupo ran things there.
And that alliance was important.
Hugely important. The Morello-Lupo partnership really solidified their power and allowed them to branch out into bigger things.
Like counterfeiting. That sounds like a major operation.
It really was. And fascinatingly, it stretched across the Atlantic.
Back to Sicily.
Yeah. In 1903, they teamed up with a big Sicilian mafioso, Don Vito Cascioferro. They were printing counterfeit $5 bills in Sicily and smuggling them into the U.S.
Well, that's pretty sophisticated for the early 1900s.
It really shows an early grasp of, international networks. High risk, high reward. Became a hallmark of organized crime later.
And this counterfeiting, it seems linked to some pretty grim stuff, the barrel murders.
Ominous name, isn't it? And brutal reality. Several murders, like Giuseppe Joe Catania Sr., his body was found in July 1902, are thought to be connected to the Morellos and this counterfeiting ring.
Just stuffed in a barrel.
Yeah, a gruesome signature for that period.
And there's one specific barrel murder case detailed here. Benedetto Madonia, 1903. Seems like a big deal.
It was a critical moment. Madonia was the brother-in-law of a police informant, found dead, tortured in a barrel.
How did they connect it to the Morellos?
A Secret Service detective working the counterfeiting angle traced Madonia to a restaurant. He'd been seen there with Ignazio Lupo and another figure, Tommaso the Ox Petto.
And Detective Joseph Petrosino gets involved.
Yeah?
He pops up a lot in early Mafia history.
He does. Petrosino confirmed Madonia's identity, and then they found a letter from Madonia.
Saying what?
Saying he wanted out, wanted to leave the organization. Which, gives you a motive right there, shows the internal pressure.
So they made arrests. Lupo, Morello, Petto.
Yeah, they arrested the key players, even the restaurant owner. But
the charges didn't stick.
nope. Witnesses changed their stories. A classic problem, even back then when dealing with organized crime. The charges were dropped.
Frustrating. But despite that, the Morellos kept growing. Still into counterfeiting.
Seems so. They solidified their grip on Upper Manhattan, but the counterfeiting eventually caught up with them again.
Oh.
November 1909, big police raid up in Highland, New York. Found a building the Morellos were using.
And inside.
A ton of counterfeit cash. American and Canadian dollars.
Okay, that's bad. But it got worse. Something about letters.
Yeah, they also found letters. Letters from victims of the Black Hand down in New Orleans.
Black Hand. That was like an extortion racket, right? Threatening letters.
Exactly. Very common in Italian immigrant communities then. Finding those letters linked the Morello operation directly to that kind of widespread extortion.
So the raid snowballed.
Big time. Led to 15 arrests, including Giuseppe Morello himself, Ignazio Lupo again, and another guy, Pasquale Vassi, caught holding like $1,200 in fake bills.
And this time the charges stuck.
They did. Trials started January 1910, wrapped up by February 19th. Convictions across the board.
What kind of sentences?
Heavy ones. Giuseppe Morello got 30 years. Lupo got 25. Sent off to Atlanta Federal Prison.
Wow. So the top two leaders, gone. Just like that.
Creates a huge power vacuum, right? Suddenly the guys at the top are locked away for decades.
So who steps in?
Nick Terranova, remember Giuseppe Morello's half-brother? He takes over, along with his brothers Vincenzo and Ciro. The next generation steps up.
And they kept the business running.
Oh, yeah. They were active all over East Harlem, down to Greenwich Village. They even had this place, the Venezia restaurant.
What was that?
Became a real underworld hangout. A place for meetings, deals, coordinating things, probably.
But with Morello and Lupo gone, the family must have seemed weaker.
Definitely. And others saw an opportunity. There's a captain, Katana Reina.
Mm-hmm.
He basically broke off and started his own family, mostly up in the Bronx. It shows the instability, Loyalty only goes so far when there's a chance to grab power.
And Nick Terranova tried to, unite the different Italian gangs, Sicilians and Neapolitans.
Yeah, he tried in the early 1910s, but it didn't really work out. Too many differences, too much rivalry between the Sicilian Mafia groups and the Neapolitan Camorra groups.
Like the Brooklyn Camorra. They were Neapolitan.
Primarily, yes. Different backgrounds, different ways of doing things than the Sicilian Morellos. Natural friction there.
So instead of uniting everyone, the Morellos ended up allying with some Camorra guys in East Harlem.
Right. Seems strategic. They teamed up with guys like Giuseppe Gallucci and the Lamonti brothers, who were apparently cousins.
Why? What did they gain?
Probably needed the muscle, the local connections Gallucci had. Bolstering their own position, maybe, because they were weaker without Morello and Lupo.
But that alliance didn't last long.
Fell apart after Gallucci died. And that's when things really heated up with the Brooklyn Camorra. Led straight into the Mafia-Camorra War.
Sounds intense.
It was. Very bloody. The Brooklyn Camorra basically decided to try and wipe out the Manhattan Mafia, including the Morellos.
How did it start?
Early 1916, the Camorra boss, Pellegrino Morano, and his lieutenant, Vincenzo Paragallo, they start moving into Morello territory. 6 months of fighting back and forth.
And then it ended. Badly. An ambush.
Yeah, a supposed truce meeting. Morano suggested it. September 7th, 1916, at a cafe on Navy Street in Brooklyn, owned by Alessandro Vogliero.
And Nick Terranova went.
He did, with his bodyguard, Charles Ubriaco, walked right into it, 5 Brooklyn Camorra guys ambushed them, killed them both.
Devastating for the Morellos. Nick was the boss then.
Exactly. A huge blow. Looked like the Camorra had won.
But it didn't quite work out that way for them either.
No. Funny how these things turn out. The Camorra victory imploded from within. Betrayal.
What happened?
2 of their own guys, Tony Natoro and Ralph Daniello, they flipped. They implicated Morano the boss and Voyero the cafe owner in Nick Morello's murder.
So the law finally caught up with Morano.
Eventually, yeah. Took some doing. Apparently a detective initially refused to help, but Morano, Voyero, other Camorra leaders convicted, imprisoned. That basically ended the Mafia Camorra War in 1917.
So with Nick dead and the Camorra leaders jailed, who's left for the Morellos?
The remaining Terranova brothers, Vincenzo and Ciro, they're trying to hold things together.
And strangely enough, some former Camorra guys end up joining them.
Yeah, shows how alliances shift, doesn't it? Survival power. Umberto Valenti was one, a former Brooklyn Camorra guy, now with the Morellos.
And someone else rises up around this time.
Giuseppe Masseria. He gets out of prison in 1916 and pretty quickly becomes a major player in the Morello organization. The landscape is changing fast.
But still violent. Ciro Terranova was tried for murder.
He was, yeah, 1918, accused of killing 2 gambling bosses, Charles Lombardi and Joe DeMarco.
But he got off.
Acquitted. But it shows the kind of business they were still involved in, even with all the leadership turmoil.
Okay, so things settle slightly, then boom, 1920, the old bosses are back.
Right. Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo are released from prison after a decade away.
That must have shaken things up massively.
Oh, absolutely. There was a new top dog in Manhattan by then, Salvatore Tequila. He'd built his own power base while they were inside.
And he didn't welcome them back with open arms?
Far from it. Saw them as a direct threat. Reports say he actually ordered them killed.
So Morello and Lupo walk out of prison, basically, with targets on their backs?
Pretty much. And this puts guys like Umberto Valenti, the ex-Camorra guy, in a really tight spot.
How so?
Well, Tequila is powerful, but Masseria is rising within the Morello faction. Valenti apparently fell out of favor with Tequila, so to get back in his good graces.
He targets Masseria.
Exactly. Tries to take out Masseria, which of course sparks another internal war. Lots of failed assassination attempts on Masseria.
This sounds incredibly chaotic. Retaliation back and forth.
Totally chaotic. December 1921, Masseria's guys kill a Valenti ally, Salvatore Moro.
Valenti hits back.
He does. May 1922, he has Vincent Terranova, who is technically the Morello boss at that point, murdered, takes out another leader.
But Valenti couldn't finish the job with Masseria?
No. Masseria retaliates again. Orders Valenti killed. His guys ambush Valenti and his bodyguard.
Yeah.
Bodyguard's killed. Valenti escapes that time, but not for long.
Masseria's crew catches up with him.
August 11th, 1922. Masseria's guys, and some say a young Charlie Luciano was involved here.
Really? Luciano?
That's the story. They finally track down Valenti and kill him. End of that conflict.
So after all that bloodshed, Masseria comes out on top.
Firmly on top. Giuseppe Joe the boss, Masseria, becomes the undisputed boss of the Morello family.
And what happens to Giuseppe Morello, the original founder, who just got out of prison?
In a kind of fascinating, maybe symbolic move, the old man, Giuseppe Morello, becomes Masseria's underboss, his advisor, essentially. A new era begins, but with a nod to the old guard.
Wow. Looking back at the leadership list,
Yeah.
it's just brutal. Boss is imprisoned, murdered. Underboss is the same.
It really highlights the instability, doesn't it? Giuseppe Morello starts it, gets jailed. Nick Terranova takes over, gets killed. Vincenzo Terranova takes over from him, gets killed. Ciro steps down. Morello comes back briefly, steps down for Masseria.
And the underbosses mirror that. Lupo jailed, Vincenzo becomes underboss, then boss, then murdered. Ciro steps down, Vincenzo again briefly before he's murdered. Then Morello himself becomes underboss until he's eventually murdered too.
It's a relentless cycle of violence and shifting power, just constant internal struggle.
And there were other players involved too, right? Not just the top guys.
Oh, sure. Guys like Giuseppe Finaro, linked to that 1903 barrel murder, who got murdered himself later. Eugene Charles Ubriaco, killed with Nick Morello. And Tommaso, the ox pedo, known as an associate, a hitman, part of the machinery.
So let's wrap this up. We've really seen the Morello family rise from Sicily, establish themselves in New York.
Become a dominant force, yeah.
Yeah.
Through things like that big counterfeiting operation.
Through violent wars with rivals like the Camorra.
And constant, brutal, internal power struggles. Frequent leadership changes, often ending in death. And you can't discount the role of omerta, that code of silence. It must have helped them operate under the radar, especially early on.
Definitely. And this whole journey from the 107th Street mob through the wars, the leadership changes.
Yeah.
It really set the stage for what came later, didn't it?
Absolutely. They laid the foundation for the more structured mafia families that would dominate the 20th century. You see the evolution right here.
And that detail about the counterfeiting, starting in Sicily,
Sure.
causing murders in New York, just shows how connected things were even then.
Right. Not just local street gangs. These were early international criminal networks. Pretty amazing for the time.
So for you, listening, understanding this history of families like the Morellos gives you that crucial context. You see how organized crime evolved, how its impact
These
grew.
weren't just isolated events. They were building something, piece by bloody piece. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this really tell us about how early organized crime worked?
Yeah, all that betrayal, the violence within the family.
Exactly. What does it say about power? About loyalty in that world? Was it just fundamentally unstable? Or was that simply the cost of doing business back then?
A really provocative thought. And you have to ask, do we still see echoes of those early struggles, that fragile loyalty, and how we understand organized crime today?
It's a powerful question to leave things on. Makes you think about the enduring patterns.
Definitely does. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex and violent origins of the Morello crime family.